Tom Parmenter, thank you for that update, and we will of course keep a very close eye on the situation in Haymarket while that protest continues and the police continue their operation to try to contain it. In the meantime, let's discuss the strike today that's been going on and the full impact of it by public sector workers. It's likely to take some days to dissect exactly what that impact will be, but should they have been on strike at all? Well, let's discuss just that issue. Linda Perks is a regional secretary for Unison in Greater London. She thinks that they should. Mark Littlewood, the director of the Institute of Economic Affairs, thinks they should not. Let's find out why. They join us from our Westminster studios. Linda Perks, to you first of all. Francis Maude, the Cabinet Office Minister, has called these strikes inappropriate, untimely and irresponsible, especially while talks are going on. Why do you think that's wrong?
I think it's wrong because the government has decided that it's going to impose changes on the pension schemes, which are going to mean that all public sector workers are going to have to pay half as much again as what they're paying now for their pensions and work longer. And they're not negotiating with us at all. They're trying to impose this by edict, and what we want to do is sit down around the table and negotiate this thing properly.
OK, Mark Littlewood, what the government is asking is unfair and they're not going about it in the right way, according to Unison.
Well, insofar as I have any sympathy with the strikers today, and I have to say that sympathy is pretty limited, that my only sympathy is that I'm afraid successive governments have lied to public sector workers about the viability of these colossally generous pensions that have been promised over the years, enormously more generous than most people in the private sector can even dream of. There is a huge hole in the public finances, a liability that's going to have to be met, and we cannot meet that on the basis of the present pensions arrangements. I mean, good luck to the trade unions and the government in terms of their negotiations, but this isn't an imposition by edict. This will be changes made by our democratically elected parliament.
That's just not true, I'm afraid. That really is not true.
Which bit of it's not true?
The health service pension scheme at the moment produces £2 billion worth of positive profit that goes back into the Treasury.
Mark Littlewood, just let Linda Perks make her point and then you can come back.
So the health service pension scheme is putting £2 billion worth back into the Treasury, and the local government scheme is making between £4 and £5 billion worth of money that's going back into the markets. The problem with the government's proposals is that if they continue to move towards increasing the amount that people pay into the schemes, then the probability is that people will walk away with their feet and the schemes will become unviable. That will then mean, of course, that when people retire, they will only be relying on their state pension and state handouts. It's crazy economics.
OK, Mark Littlewood.
That sounds to me like crazy economics. Firstly, on these supposed surpluses in the schemes, if the trade unions are offering to take over these schemes because they think there's such a big surplus in them and ask for no further taxpayer contribution to these schemes in years ahead, run away with it now. Take your £2 billion surplus and don't ask me or other taxpayers for any further contributions. In terms of walking with their feet, well, look, if people leave the public sector and go and work in the private sector, which about 3/4 of the workforce do, you make your own pension arrangements. I make my own pension arrangements. I pay in. I don't have a guarantee from the government of some proportion of my salary being paid out to me when I retire when I'm 60 or 65. It will depend how well my investments go and how much of my own salary I choose to save. And the private sector has gone through a lot of austerity. Worth remembering, the average worker in the private sector earns less than the average public sector worker, so don't confuse the strikers today with the Tolpodal martyrs. These are typically people who are on above average salaries, not below average salaries. And there is an enormous pensions time bomb here because of promises that have been made that cannot possibly be kept. And they could not be kept even if it hadn't been for the banking crisis.
But Linda Perks, the point I think Mark Littlewood is making is that we have got an ageing population, haven't we? We've also got our finances, the government's finances in a terrible state. We can't afford to carry on paying pensions at this level, can we? And isn't it the taxpayer who has to fund the difference? Is that fair?
But the pension schemes are funded by the workers who pay their contributions into them. And it is workers who are paying into the schemes and making their savings so that they then have a pension at the end. The employers also make a contribution in, and that, until relatively recently, in our lifetimes, was also done by private employers. The private employers have chosen to stop doing that now, and that means that there are large parts of the population who no longer have the benefit of a pension scheme in the private sector. That's because the employers have chosen to walk away. We are concerned that workers are able to make savings in their lifetime at work so that they are not dependent on the state when they retire. We think that's a perfectly reasonable position to take, and we believe that that should be available actually for all workers, not just public sector workers. And it's something that indeed many private sector workers still have and many more would like to have.
Well, of course people would like to have it, Linda. I would love to have a guarantee that when I retire at the age of 60, I will be paid 50% of my salary for the rest of my life. But I'm afraid it's just not financially viable. And of course, if we look at the public sector, I mean, the typical pension of a nurse, in terms of what they're presently paid out at the moment, is worth about 40% of their salary. Most people in the private sector have pension schemes worth about 10% of their salary. And you can't just top this up by some magic pot of gold. There isn't one. What's at stake here is whether you want relatively low-paid people in the private sector, hairdressers, waitresses, bar staff and the like, perhaps earning 10, 12, 15,000 a year, to be contributing to the extremely generous pensions of relatively more affluent people in the public sector.
But can I just interrupt just for one moment? Mark Littlewood, Len McCluskey makes the point that the government will take 16% of income from public sector workers by holding down their pay for 4 years, but leaves the banking tax at just 0.08%. Could the money not be found from elsewhere?
Well, I think, look, there's an awful mess to sort out in the banking sector, but I don't think we can cling to this ridiculously forlorn hope that if we just continually tax the bankers more and more, we can promise all sorts of financial goodies for everybody else in the United Kingdom. There is a limit to how much can be squeezed out of the banking sector. The private sector pay has pretty much frozen in the last 2 years, and I don't think that public sector pay being frozen and then going up by 1%, these are not numbers which would be remotely unusual to those in the private sector. That's what the private sector's had to go through. The private sector's had to go through pension reform as well.
Mark is presenting a very improper picture about what is happening with public sector pensions. For a start, there has been a wage freeze in the public sector for 3 years, and there is effectively going to be a freeze for the next 2 years. The average take-home pension for a woman working in local government is £56 a week, and that's after working a lifetime in public services. The average take-home pension of a nurse in the health service is not much more than £3,000 a year after working in a lifetime in the health service. So these figures that Mark is talking about excessive gold-plated pension schemes is just not true. And the importance of workers being able to save whilst they're working for their retirement is very important.
Okay, I'm so sorry, Mark, I'm going to have to cut you short. Both of you, I can see that we haven't come to a great deal of agreement here, but we appreciate you discussing it. Thank you so much for joining us on Sky News, Linda Perks and Mark Littlewood. You're watching Sky News. We'll have all the latest on the protests and the strike around London, as well as this particular offshoot protest in central London after this short break.